When timing goes wrong, did I ruin her day? My name is Sarah, and this past weekend marked a milestone in our family, my younger sister's wedding. It was the kind of event you see in glossy magazines. Over 200 guests, a sprawling venue, a stunning dress that had taken months to finalize. For my sister, it was everything she'd dreamed of since we were kids. For me, it was a moment of celebration for her, despite my own unique situation. I was 38 weeks pregnant. Planning to attend wasn't a decision I made lightly. At first, I'd considered skipping it altogether, but after talking to my doctor, who assured me that everything looked fine with the pregnancy and the hospital was just a short 20-minute drive from the venue, I decided to go. There had been no complications up to that point, and I didn't want to miss one of the most important days in my sister's life. After all, she was my younger sister, someone I had shared every major moment with since childhood. This was her day to shine, and I wanted to be there to cheer her on. The morning of the wedding, I felt fine. My husband, Jack, made sure I was comfortable, and we had a plan in place in case anything unexpected happened. The ceremony was beautiful. Watching my sister walk down the aisle, glowing with happiness, I felt a deep sense of pride and joy for her. I clapped along with the guests, relishing the magic of the moment. At the reception, I was careful not to overdo it. I mingled, caught up with family and friends, and basked in the celebratory atmosphere. Little did I know, the joyful rhythm of the day would soon take an unexpected turn. My sister, Lily, and I have always been close. Growing up, we were inseparable, the kind of siblings who could finish each other's sentences and understood each other without needing to say a word. Being just 2 years apart, we shared everything: clothes, secrets, and even our most ambitious dreams. I was her protector, her confidant, and at times her biggest cheerleader. When Lily got engaged, it was no surprise she immediately called me. I remember her voice trembling with excitement as she told me about the proposal, describing every detail as if she were reliving the moment. She asked me to be her maid of honor, and I gladly accepted, thrilled to play such an important role in her special day. Even as my pregnancy progressed, I remained deeply involved in the planning. From dress fittings to cake tastings, I supported her every step of the way. I loved seeing how much thought and care she put into making the day perfect. Lily has always been a perfectionist, especially when it comes to milestones in her life. She had a clear vision for her wedding, one she had been planning for years, and she wanted everything to be flawless. I admired her determination and knew how much this day meant to her. Even as I navigated the challenges of pregnancy, I made it a point not to let her down. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Lily checked on me constantly. "Are you sure you're okay to come?" she asked more than once. I reassured her every time. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I wanted to be there for her, just as she had always been there for me. So, when the wedding day arrived, I was determined to focus all my energy on celebrating her. I wasn't just there as a guest. I was there as her sister, her biggest supporter, and someone who couldn't wait to see her shine. Little did I know, the day that was supposed to revolve around her would soon take an unexpected and dramatic turn. The wedding day was nothing short of spectacular. The venue was breathtaking, a sprawling estate with blooming gardens and elegant chandeliers that seemed to float in the air. Guests arrived in their finest attire, laughter and conversation filling the crisp autumn air. Lily, as expected, looked stunning. Her dress was a masterpiece of lace and satin, and the sheer joy on her face made her glow even brighter. For my part, I was cautious, but excited. I wore a comfortable dress that accommodated my growing belly and made sure to drink plenty of water throughout the day. Jack, ever attentive, kept an eye on me, ensuring I had a seat when I needed one, and that I wasn't overexerting myself. It felt good to be surrounded by family and friends, celebrating this milestone in Lily's life. The ceremony itself was unforgettable. As the music swelled and Lily walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I felt a lump in my throat. This was her moment. Everything she had dreamed of was unfolding before her, and I couldn't have been prouder. Vows were exchanged, Tears were shed, and when the couple kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers. It was perfect. The reception was just as lively. Guests mingled, the band played upbeat tunes, and the clinking of glasses filled the room as toasts were made to the happy couple. I did my best to stay engaged without drawing attention to myself. I caught up with family members I hadn't seen in ages and enjoyed the carefully prepared meal. At that point, everything felt right. The day was exactly what Lily had envisioned. I was happy to be part of it, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to relax, not knowing the unexpected challenge that lay ahead. It started with a twinge, barely noticeable at first, just a faint cramp low in my abdomen. I brushed it off as nothing more than Braxton Hicks contractions, those harmless practice contractions that often come late in pregnancy. After all, I'd been feeling fine all day, and my doctor had assured me that it was perfectly safe to attend the wedding. I shifted in my seat, sipped some water, and tried to refocus on the lively chatter around me. But as the reception continued, the cramps became more persistent. They weren't painful exactly, but there was a pattern to them now, a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I mentioned it to Jack in passing, trying to sound casual. "Probably just Braxton Hicks," I said with a smile, though the tightening in my stomach was starting to make me uneasy. He looked at me with concern. "Are you sure you're okay? Do you want to sit down for a bit?" "I'm fine," I insisted, not wanting to alarm anyone or shift focus away from Lily's big day. The last thing I wanted was to be a distraction. I promised myself I'd wait it out, see if the cramps would pass. An hour later, they hadn't. In fact, they were getting stronger. I excused myself quietly and made my way to the bathroom, hoping some fresh air and a moment to myself might help. That's when I noticed the blood. It wasn't a lot, but enough to make my heart race. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink as panic started to creep in. Something was wrong. I hurried back to Jack, whispering urgently, "We need to go. Now." His face immediately mirrored my fear, but he didn't hesitate. Together, we slipped out of the reception as discreetly as possible. I didn't want to cause a scene, but deep down, I knew this was serious. All I could think about was getting to the hospital and keeping our baby safe. Jack and I moved quickly but quietly through the venue, careful not to attract attention as we headed toward the car. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the adrenaline kicking in, though I tried to keep my breathing steady. Every step felt heavier, the cramps now undeniable and sharp. Jack held my arm firmly, guiding me out the side door, his own worry barely masked behind a calm demeanor. Once in the car, Jack started the engine without a word and began the short drive to the hospital. The silence between us was thick, broken only by my attempts to stay calm. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, counting the minutes. 20 minutes had never felt so long. I clutched my stomach, the cramps now more intense. "It's going to be okay," Jack reassured me, though his grip on the steering wheel told a different story. I nodded, focusing on his words, but the fear was growing. What if we were too late? What if something was wrong with the baby? The hospital staff reacted immediately when we arrived. The nurses took one look at me and rushed me into a wheelchair. Jack stayed by my side as I explained what had happened. Words like emergency and C-section filled the air, and before I could process what was happening, they were prepping me for surgery. The speed of it all was overwhelming. One moment I was at my sister's wedding, celebrating her new life. The next, I was on a hospital bed, preparing to bring my own child into the world. There was no time to think, no time to feel guilty about leaving the reception early. All I could focus on was the hope that our baby would be okay. The hospital room was a blur of activity. Nurses and doctors moved quickly around me, their voices calm but urgent as they prepared for the emergency C-section. Jack was by my side, squeezing my hand and whispering words of encouragement. I tried to focus on his face, grounding myself in his steady presence, but the fear was overwhelming. My mind raced with questions I didn't have time to ask. Was the baby okay? What had gone wrong? Would everything turn out all right? I had imagined this moment so many times during my pregnancy, the first time I would meet my baby. But never like this. There was no time for the calm, controlled experience I had hoped for. Instead, there was an edge of chaos, and I had no choice but to trust the medical team. "Everything is going to be fine," the doctor assured me as they prepped me for surgery. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. My body was trembling, partly from the stress and partly from the medications coursing through me. Jack leaned close, his voice low and soothing. "We've got this. Just breathe." The procedure itself felt surreal. I could hear the medical staff working, their voices a mix of technical terms and reassurance. But it felt distant, as though I were watching it happen to someone else. Jack stayed by my head the entire time, his hand never leaving mine. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat, I heard it. The sharp, unmistakable cry of a newborn. Tears streamed down my face as the nurse held up our baby. "It's a boy," she announced with a smile. Relief flooded my entire being. He was healthy. He was safe. For a moment, nothing else mattered. The weight of the world lifted as I realized that we had made it through the scariest moment of my life. As they took the baby to be checked and cleaned, I looked at Jack. His eyes were filled with tears, mirroring my own. In that instant, we were overwhelmed with gratitude and love, even as the reality of everything else began to set in. Holding my son for the first time was a moment of pure magic. Despite the whirlwind of fear and urgency that had brought us here, none of it seemed to matter as I cradled him in my arms. His tiny fingers curled around mine, and his soft cries filled the room, grounding me in the present. He was perfect, healthy, strong, and so full of life. Jack sat beside me, his eyes never leaving the baby. "He's amazing," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, it was just the three of us, cocooned in a bubble of quiet joy. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. The chaos of the day melted away, replaced by an indescribable connection to this little person we had brought into the world. But that peace didn't last long. The nurses and doctors remained efficient, checking my vitals and monitoring the baby, ensuring that we were both stable. It was clear they were doing everything possible to keep us safe, but their presence was a constant reminder of how close we had come to something far worse. Then came the questions. As news of our emergency spread, family members began showing up at the hospital. First, it was my parents, their faces etched with worry. My mother hugged me tightly, her relief palpable as she kissed the top of my head. "Thank God you're both okay," she murmured. My father, always stoic, lingered by the door but couldn't hide the emotion in his eyes. Soon, other relatives followed. I was grateful for their concern, but with every familiar face, a gnawing guilt began to creep in. I hadn't wanted to disrupt Lily's wedding, yet here we were, my medical emergency pulling people away from her big day. Even as I held my son, I couldn't shake the feeling that this joy had come at a cost. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. While I was still adjusting to the reality of being a mother and recovering from surgery, whispers of discontent began to reach me. My parents had left Lily's wedding immediately upon hearing what happened, and they weren't the only ones. Several other relatives concerned for my safety had followed suit. At first, I thought Lily would understand. After all, it was an emergency, something completely out of my control. But when I finally got a chance to check my phone, I saw a flurry of messages that told a different story. One stood out, a curt text from Lily. "Congrats, but you couldn't have waited until after the wedding?" Waited? The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stared at the screen, reading and rereading her words. Surely she couldn't mean that. How could I have waited when it was a medical emergency? I didn't choose this timing. It chose me. Then came the calls. My mom called first, reassuring me that I'd done the right thing, and that Lily was simply emotional. "She's upset about the timing, but she'll come around," she said gently. But the tone in her voice told me that Lily was more than just upset. A few hours later, my aunt stopped by the hospital to visit the baby. As we chatted, she let slip that Lily had been venting to anyone who would listen at the reception. "She feels like her day was ruined," my aunt admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "But you know how she is. She's always dreamed about this wedding." Hearing that stung more than I wanted to admit. My joy over my son's safe arrival began to feel tainted by the growing resentment I knew Lily was harboring. Part of me wanted to defend myself, to call her and explain that I hadn't intended to overshadow her big day. But another part of me, the part that was utterly exhausted from the physical and emotional toll of the day, knew it wasn't the time. Still, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Could I have handled it differently? Had I truly ruined Lily's wedding, even unintentionally? Those questions lingered, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. The first real confrontation with Lily happened a few days after the wedding. I was still in the hospital, recovering and adjusting to life with a newborn, when she called. For a moment, I was relieved to see her name on the screen. Maybe she was reaching out to check on me or the baby. But the second I answered, her voice, sharp and accusatory, cut through any hope of reconciliation. "I can't believe you," she began, not bothering with a greeting. "You couldn't have picked another time for this? You stole the spotlight on my day, Sarah." I was stunned. "Lily, it was an emergency," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I didn't plan this. I had no control over when it happened." "But you didn't have to tell everyone right away," she snapped. "Mom and Dad left, half the family left, and suddenly everyone was more focused on you than on my wedding." Her words stung more than I expected. "Lily, I was bleeding. I thought something was wrong with the baby. What was I supposed to do? Pretend everything was fine?" "You could have waited until after the reception to tell people," she countered, her tone icy. "You completely ruined the mood." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her anger, her lack of understanding, it was almost too much to bear. "Lily, I'm sorry the timing wasn't ideal, but this was a life-or-death situation. Do you even hear yourself?" She didn't respond right away, and when she did, her voice was quieter, but no less cold. "I just wanted one day to be about me. That's all." The call ended shortly after, leaving me drained and conflicted. Her words lingered, and despite knowing I had done the right thing, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if she was right to be upset. After that phone call, I felt an overwhelming mix of frustration and sadness. I wanted to shake off Lily's accusations, but they clung to me, seeping into every quiet moment I had in the hospital. Jack tried to reassure me, saying her reaction was unreasonable. "She's angry now, but she'll come around," he said. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The day after the call, I decided to reach out again, hoping to clear the air. I drafted a message to Lily, pouring out my thoughts. I apologized, again, for the timing, even though it wasn't something I could control. I explained how terrified I had been, how every decision that day had been made with the sole purpose of keeping my baby safe. I wanted her to understand that none of this had been intentional. Her response was brief and dismissive. "I've already heard enough about your emergency. Thanks for the reminder of how you stole my day." Reading those words hurt more than I expected. I felt my chest tighten as I realized she wasn't interested in hearing my side or forgiving me. It was as though nothing I said or did could make her see that I wasn't the villain in this story. Still, I felt compelled to defend myself. I reached out to my parents, explaining the call and her messages. My mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to reassure me. "Sarah, you did what you had to do. Anyone would have gone to the hospital in your situation. Don't let Lily's emotions make you second-guess yourself." While her words offered some comfort, they didn't erase the weight of the guilt Lily had placed on me. Every time I thought about her wedding, I replayed the events of that day, wondering if I could have handled it differently. Could I have been quieter about leaving? Should I have told fewer people about the emergency? Even though I knew, logically, that none of this was my fault, Lily's anger planted seeds of doubt that were hard to ignore. As much as I wanted to move forward and focus on my new life as a mom, her words lingered, making it impossible to let go. It didn't take long for Lily's anger to ripple through the rest of the family. The once joyful group text chain from her wedding planning was now eerily silent. My mom and dad firmly supported me, but other relatives seemed divided. Some offered quiet congratulations on the birth of my son, while others kept their distance, likely trying to avoid choosing sides. My aunt, always one for blunt honesty, reached out to me a few days after the wedding. "Lily's been venting to everyone," she said. "She's saying you turned her day into your day." I tried to tell her that wasn't fair, but you know how she gets when she's upset. I did know. Lily had always been headstrong, her emotions often taking the lead. But this felt different, harsher. Hearing that she was openly talking about me, framing the situation as if I had deliberately upstaged her, stung deeply. I wasn't sure how to respond. Meanwhile, Jack overheard some murmurs from his side of the family at the hospital. "It's such a shame about the wedding," one of his cousins had whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Couldn't they have kept it quiet until the next day? Even though most of the family understood the urgency of what had happened, it was clear some shared Lily's sentiment. It felt like every congratulatory message about our son came with an unspoken asterisk. But about the timing, I confided in my mom, who remained unwavering in her support. "Sarah, people love drama," she said. "They're forgetting this was a medical emergency. You didn't choose this." Her reassurance was comforting, but the tension within the family was unmistakable. I could feel the lines being drawn, and I hated that something so joyous, the birth of my son, had created such a rift. After days of stewing over the tension with Lily, I decided to try again. This time, I wrote her a heartfelt letter. I needed her to know how much I regretted the timing of everything, even though it was beyond my control. I poured my feelings onto the page, explaining how scared I had been, and how my priority had always been the safety of my baby. I apologized again, emphasizing that I hadn't intended to take anything away from her wedding day. I sent the message and waited, my phone constantly within reach. Hours turned into a full day, and when her reply finally came, it was curt and dismissive. "Thanks for the apology, but it doesn't change anything. What's done is done." Her words were a slap in the face. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. What more could I say? I had bared my heart to her, hoping she'd see my sincerity, but it was clear she wasn't ready to let this go. That evening, my mom called to check in. She had spoken with Lily and tried to mediate, but it hadn't gone well. "She's still upset, Sarah," Mom said with a sigh. "She feels like her one day was overshadowed, and she's struggling to move past it. Give her some time." Time. That was the only thing I could offer, but it didn't make the situation any easier. I kept replaying Lily's words in my head, second-guessing every decision I'd made that day. I wondered if there was anything I could have done differently, anything that might have prevented this rift. Jack tried to console me, but even he couldn't fully shake my doubts. "You did everything you could," he said. "You apologized. If she doesn't want to forgive you, that's on her, not you." His words made sense, but they didn't ease the ache in my chest. I hated the idea that my actions, no matter how unintentional, had hurt my sister. Even more, I hated that my apology, no matter how genuine, hadn't been enough to fix things. For the first time, I wondered if this rift was something we might never fully repair. As the days passed, I found myself replaying the events over and over, scrutinizing every choice I'd made. Had I been irresponsible for attending the wedding so late in my pregnancy? Should I have stayed home, even though my doctor had cleared me? The more I thought about it, the more tangled my emotions became. Attending the wedding had felt like the right decision at the time. Lily had been so excited for me to be there, and I didn't want to disappoint her. I had taken precautions. I stayed near home. I didn't overexert myself, and I had Jack ready to help at a moment's notice. I'd even made sure the hospital was close to the venue just in case. On paper, it all made sense. But now, knowing how it all turned out, I couldn't help but wonder if I had underestimated the risks. Of course, no one could have predicted the timing. My pregnancy had been smooth, with no signs of complications. The cramps and bleeding had come out of nowhere. I tried to remind myself that even if I had stayed home that day, the emergency still would have happened. The wedding had simply been an unfortunate backdrop to something I couldn't control. But logic didn't erase the guilt. It didn't stop me from thinking about the guests who left early, the way Lily's dream day had been disrupted. I felt caught in a loop, torn between defending my actions and feeling deeply sorry for how everything had unfolded. As I held my newborn son, I tried to focus on the joy of his safe arrival. Yet, the lingering doubts remained. Was it reckless to attend the wedding, or was I simply unlucky? The questions nagged at me, their answers just out of reach. Becoming a mother was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life, and in many ways, it was. Every time I looked at my son, I felt an overwhelming sense of love and gratitude. But that joy was often overshadowed by the cloud of conflict with Lily and the doubts she had planted in my mind. Motherhood had already begun to shift my priorities. Things that once seemed monumental, like perfecting every detail for a major event, now felt less important compared to the well-being of my child. My world had narrowed to the simple yet profound tasks of keeping him safe, fed, and loved. And yet, I couldn't fully immerse myself in this new chapter because of the weight of Lily's anger and my own nagging guilt. I found myself constantly questioning whether I had handled the situation as well as I could have. Could I have stayed quieter at the wedding? Should I have told fewer people when I left? Maybe if I hadn't been so visibly distressed, fewer family members would have followed us to the hospital, and Lily wouldn't feel so robbed of her moment. But then I'd circle back to the reality of the situation. This wasn't something I chose or could control. It was a medical emergency, plain and simple. What frustrated me the most was the feeling of being misunderstood. From my perspective, everything I'd done had been driven by necessity and instinct. Yet, in Lily's eyes, it seemed as though I'd made a selfish choice to take the spotlight from her. That perception hurt deeply, especially because I knew how much her wedding day meant to her. In quieter moments, I tried to remind myself that I wasn't just Lily's sister anymore. I was a mother now. My decisions had to prioritize my child, no matter the circumstances. But that realization didn't erase the pain of feeling like I'd let my sister down. Balancing those two roles, sister and mother, was proving to be far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. As word of the hospital emergency spread, so too did the opinions of the wedding guests. It wasn't long before their perspectives started trickling back to me through whispers, texts, and secondhand accounts. Some of the comments were supportive and understanding. "You can't control when a baby decides to come," one of my cousins said when she visited the hospital. "I'm just glad you're okay." But not everyone saw it that way. A friend of Lily's posted a vague but pointed message on social media the day after the wedding. "Some people really know how to steal the spotlight, SMH." Though it didn't mention me by name, the timing and tone made it clear who she was talking about. Other guests were more discreet, but no less critical. A family friend called my mom to check in and casually mentioned how unfortunate it was that so much attention had been diverted from the bride. Another relative asked Jack outright if we'd considered waiting until the next morning to let people know, as if that had been a feasible option during an emergency. Hearing these comments made my chest tighten with frustration. It seemed like, to some people, the optics of the wedding mattered more than the fact that my son's life had been at risk. I knew I shouldn't let their opinions bother me. These were people who hadn't been in my shoes, people who couldn't understand the sheer panic I'd felt in that moment. But the criticism still stung, especially because it only seemed to validate Lily's feelings. Jack tried to shield me from the worst of it, but there was no escaping the sense that my emergency had cast a shadow over what should have been Lily's perfect day. The divide between understanding and judgment grew wider with every passing comment, leaving me feeling more isolated than ever. I knew how much Lily's wedding meant to her, and I tried to remind myself of that as the tension between us deepened. She had dreamed about this day for years, meticulously planning every detail down to the color of the table linens and the floral arrangements. It wasn't just about the ceremony or the reception. It was about the culmination of everything she'd envisioned for her fairy tale moment. Growing up, Lily had always been the one who fantasized about her wedding. I could remember us flipping through bridal magazines she'd sneak from the grocery store and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about someday. This was her someday. She deserved for it to be everything she imagined, and I could understand why she was heartbroken that it hadn't gone exactly as planned. Still, her pain didn't negate mine. What hurt the most was that she seemed unable or unwilling to see the situation from my perspective. I didn't choose to have complications that night. I didn't ask for our parents and relatives to leave the reception. If there had been any way to avoid disrupting her big day, I would have done it. But in the moment, all I could think about was getting to the hospital and making sure my baby was safe. Part of me empathized with her disappointment. Weddings are emotional, once-in-a-lifetime events, and I knew how much she'd invested in hers. But another part of me felt deeply frustrated by her unwillingness to acknowledge that I'd been in a life-or-death situation. Did she truly think I'd orchestrated an emergency just to steal the spotlight? As much as I tried to understand where she was coming from, the gap between us seemed impossible to bridge. Lily's pain was real, but so was mine. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that our relationship might never be the same. I didn't know how to make her see that I wasn't trying to compete with her moment. I was just trying to survive. When everything felt like it was spiraling, my parents became my anchor. They had been at the center of the situation, rushing to the hospital from Lily's wedding, trying to navigate the emotional minefield between their two daughters. I knew they were just as heartbroken about the rift as I was. One evening, after I was home from the hospital, my mom called to check in. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I keep replaying everything, wondering if I could have done something different. "You couldn't have," she said firmly. "Sarah, this wasn't your fault. You did what any mother would do. Lily is hurt, but that doesn't mean you were wrong." Her words brought some comfort, but they didn't erase the guilt I felt. "She thinks I ruined her day," I said quietly. "I hate that she feels that way." My dad chimed in then, his steady voice grounding the conversation. "Lily's upset because her expectations didn't match reality. She had a perfect picture in her head, and this didn't fit. But life isn't always perfect. You were in danger. You had to act. If people can't understand that, it's their problem, not yours." They both reassured me that I had done the right thing, even if it didn't feel that way in the moment. Still, they didn't downplay Lily's feelings. "Give her time," Mom said. "She's emotional, but she loves you. She just needs to come to terms with it." Their support meant everything, but it also reinforced the reality of how complicated this situation had become. I wanted to believe that Lily and I could move past this, but for the first time, I wasn't sure if time alone would be enough. Feeling stuck and unsure how to move forward, I decided to seek an outside perspective. One night, while feeding my son in the dim light of his nursery, I typed out a post for a popular online forum where people share personal dilemmas. I explained the entire situation in as much detail as possible: the wedding, the emergency C-section, Lily's anger, and the divided opinions within our family. I ended the post with a simple question: AITA? The response was overwhelming. Within hours, hundreds of comments poured in, ranging from empathetic to brutally honest. Most people were on my side. You were literally saving your baby's life. What did she expect you to do? Just sit there and wait until the wedding was over? One commenter wrote, summing up the general sentiment. Another user added, "Your sister's reaction is ridiculous. This was a medical emergency, and anyone blaming you is being selfish and irrational." It was reassuring to see so many strangers validating what I already knew deep down, that I had done the right thing in a situation where I had no other choice. Still, not every comment was kind. A few people echoed Lily's perspective, arguing that attending the wedding so close to my due date was a poor decision. "You knew there was a chance something could go wrong," one person said. "You should have stayed home. Then none of this would have happened." Those comments stung, even though they were in the minority. They echoed the doubts I'd already been grappling with, and seeing them spelled out by strangers made them feel even heavier. Despite the mixed reactions, the experience was strangely cathartic. For the first time, I felt like I was able to express everything I'd been holding inside without fear of judgment from people I knew. And while the majority of responses reassured me that I wasn't the villain in this story, it was the process of sharing my side that gave me the most relief. But even as I closed the browser and set my phone down, I couldn't help but wonder, would Lily ever see it the same way? Or would she continue to view my emergency as an unforgivable intrusion on her big day? As the days turned into weeks, I found myself revisiting the events of that day more often than I cared to admit. It wasn't just the details of what had happened, the cramps, the rush to the hospital, the surgery, but the emotional weight of it all. I replayed moments in my mind, trying to understand how things had escalated to this point. I thought about the wedding, the laughter and music, the clinking of glasses during toasts. I remembered the warmth of being surrounded by family, celebrating Lily's special day. But the memories of that joy were now tainted by what came after: the rushed departure, the worried faces of relatives arriving at the hospital, and Lily's cold message accusing me of stealing her spotlight. I couldn't help but wonder if I should have handled it differently. Maybe I could have been more discreet when I left the reception, keeping the reason vague to avoid drawing attention. Perhaps I could have waited to notify our parents until after the wedding was over. But even as I thought these things, I knew the truth. None of those choices would have changed the fact that I was in the middle of a medical emergency. There wasn't time to weigh optics against urgency. The day that started as a celebration had ended in survival, and the two felt irreconcilable. While I was grateful that my son had arrived safely, the tension with Lily made it hard to feel the full weight of that joy. I wanted to focus on the miracle of his birth, to cherish the moments of holding him and watching him sleep. But the shadow of what had happened at the wedding loomed large, casting doubt over my memories. No matter how I looked at it, that day would forever be a mix of emotions: joy and fear, relief and regret, celebration and conflict. And the hardest part was knowing that, for Lily, it might only be remembered as the day I took something from her. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that happened, I'm still torn. On one hand, I know I made the only choice I could in that moment. My instincts as a mother took over, and my only focus was on getting to the hospital and ensuring the safety of my child. It was a medical emergency, plain and simple, and any reasonable person would understand that. But on the other hand, I can't ignore the impact it had on Lily. Her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of her entire life, was disrupted in a way neither of us could have foreseen. I know how much she wanted that day to be perfect, and I hate that circumstances beyond my control took some of the shine away from her moment. What hurts the most is the rift this has caused between us. I've apologized repeatedly, tried to explain my side, and made it clear that I never intended to overshadow her. But it feels like nothing I say or do is enough to repair the damage. I miss the closeness we used to share, and I wonder if things will ever go back to the way they were. At the same time, I can't help but feel frustrated by her reaction. Weddings are important, yes, but wasn't my situation extraordinary enough to warrant some grace? Wasn't the health of my baby and me worth the slight disruption? The more I think about it, the more I wonder if her anger is less about the actual events and more about her own struggle to adjust her expectations. And so I'm left here, questioning myself over and over. Could I have done anything differently? Was it selfish of me to attend the wedding at all? Or is Lily's reaction an overreach, fueled by emotions she's struggling to manage? I don't have the answers. All I can do is put the question out there. Am I the asshole? Did I ruin her wedding? Or was this just an unfortunate situation where nobody was truly at fault? I'll let you decide.